Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Nensebo Mewa wash processed Ethiopia from John Small Roastery. There's the bag right there. And John Small, based out of Seoul, South Korea, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions earlier this year, as Airworks Coffee brought them in as part of their July coffee drop. And interestingly enough, Airworks said that they had such positive feedback on this coffee roaster that they decided to do a special order for people that were interested in trying some more of John Small's coffees. And even though I had some mixed reactions to the two coffees that we did review from them, I felt like it was worth revisiting this coffee roaster to kind of get a better idea of them overall. So it'll be interesting to see how these coffees turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. Once again, it is still in line with our previous experiences with John Small, which aren't necessarily the lightest roasted coffees out there. I would say that once again, they are lighter relative to a lot of the other Korean-based coffee roasters that we've had. But even then, there's still a bit more development to them than even the average American coffee roasters. So once again, I feel like the safest way to describe their roast profile is being on the more developed side of that light medium range. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60. And the coffee does share some similarities to the Olive from John Small, which is one of the coffees that we had reviewed earlier this year, as it has a very similar profile with the base, but this one skewed a little bit more on the citric side of things, with a listed lime being the most abundant characteristic. Subtlety to the peach aspect, but otherwise a slightly spiced tea-like component to this one. And that first takeaway was they have a similar theme to their wash processed Ethiopian coffees, because I just felt like the Ala was very peach forward and this one was very citric forward, but outside of that, the coffees had a lot of similarities to them. Day 18 through the Chemex, and the coffee was offering a similar but less intense experience, as there's a further focus on the citric tones of this coffee. It does have a slightly vintage feel to it, with the sugariness also being present within the stone fruit. In addition to that, there's more of that spiced quality, but I would say solid overall for the most part for these first couple of tries. We move on to day 21 as we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee does continue to offer a lot of similarities to the Olo in terms of the profile, with the biggest difference continuing to be that heightened focus on the citric lime-like attribute. In addition to that, it's slightly marred by the overall development, which was also my biggest issue with the Olo, as once again, they're not necessarily overly light, and I feel like it slightly impacts the coffee enough to the point where it takes away from the overall cleanliness and experience of the coffee. Otherwise, it does offer plenty of the tea-like expectations, this one once again. Day 24 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and there were some mixed results, as it has helped tone down some of the development and the citric qualities, but as a result, it's better pronounced in a slightly honeysuckle-like florality and a better, well-defined white peach aspect. The citrus does remain the most abundant quality nonetheless, as it definitely shone through a little bit more within the finish. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this is the most amount of the roasting qualities that we've felt up to this point, as there's a semi-strong burnt popcorn honeysuckle-like feel to the coffee. The citric lime aspect is slightly toned down as a result, with some subtle sugary stone fruit present in the intermediary of this one. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee still has a very similar feel and profile to the Ala, with a bit more intensity coming in that citric sense. One of the better days nonetheless, as anytime I was able to get it kind of reminiscent of that Ala coffee, I was actually enjoying it much more than the other days. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and there's more struggles through this brew method, as this seems to be a bit tame, presenting the opportunity for the development of this coffee to be much more prominent. In addition to that, there's more of the lime-like brightness that's dominating this one, so this one was an okay day, once again skewing a lot in the direction that I wasn't necessarily enjoying for it. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee has been pretty consistent in this brew method with this recipe, as it's quite citric forward, with plenty of the listed lemongrass aspects present and being one of the more dominant components of this coffee as well. In general, it feels like it might have peaked, as it's been a bit stagnant for a bit at this point, as there's a citric and stone fruit sense to it, but for the most part, they haven't necessarily been expanded upon from some of the earlier days. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so let's go through those. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So even though I continued to mention and harp on the fact that there's a little bit of development that's kind of marring this coffee in general, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was present or prominent enough to take away from the overall cleanliness and clarity of this coffee. So level 4 was still a good place to put it, especially given that there was really nice definition to a lot of the citric aspects within this coffee. Move on to the finish at that level 4. And as I kind of mentioned, the finish oftentimes does come out both spiced tea and in addition to that, much more citric forward. So those things, not necessarily things that I look for, especially within wash processed Ethiopian coffee. So wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the finish, especially given that at times it could come a little bit more within that slightly smoky quality. Sweetness level 4. And I do have to say that the sweetness was one of the better aspects of this coffee. I wasn't necessarily expecting it to maybe come out as sweet as it did. That's the same case that happened with the aloe, as both of them just happened to be a little bit sweeter for Ethiopian coffees in general. Even then, it came out much more sweet in a slightly citric sense, so wasn't necessarily enjoying that quality of it. Acidity level 4, that's probably one of the biggest surprises for me, but given that there was such a strong citric quality, then perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising. Lemongrass, lime, both of them being listed on there, definitely gave this coffee a fair bit of brightness to go alongside that. Morality level 4, one of the better traits and aspects for me, especially when I was able to get a bit more definition and pronunciation to what I would describe as being that honeysuckle-like tone to this one. So definitely plenty of floral aspects. Washed Ethiopian coffee fully expected there. Citrus fruit level 4. Not the biggest fan of citrus fruit. I mentioned that time and time again, and given that this one skewed so heavily and so strong in that lime-like direction, was never necessarily going to be an endearing quality to me on this coffee, but if I want to give it credit for something, it was pretty well defined and pretty consistent within it throughout. 1 level 3, 2 level 3s it looks like. So the spiced quality level 3, yeah, as I kind of mentioned, that there's a very strong spiced tea tone to it. That's where the savoriness also comes into play. I can't quite recall whether or not they had any sort of tea note listed here on this coffee, but if they did, it would not come as a surprise to me whatsoever, given that it was very pronounced. And once again, we are working with a washed Ethiopian coffee. Stone fruit level 3, and if there's anything I wish I could have gotten a little bit more out of, it's that stone fruit, because at times it was prominent enough to the point where it equaled the citric aspect, but given that the citrus really seems to dominate the overall fruit experience within this one, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the amount of the stone fruit that we did get. When it was prominent and present, it was one of the more enjoyable aspects of this coffee. Last thing worth discussing, body level 2. Once again, given that we're talking about a washed Ethiopian coffee, I don't think that comes as a surprise in any regard, as this one definitely had a lighter body to it. A little bit more of a tea-like body, but enough texture to push it above that level 1 mark. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think the biggest takeaway I had from this one was that they do seem to have a bit of a trend and theme to their coffees, because I can't help but shake the feeling that this one just reminded me so much of aloe. Like, these two coffees were just so similarly profiled and tasted so similar, with the exception of one being very stone fruit and the other being very citric. And given that I have a very strong preference towards stone fruits versus citrus, it's not surprising that I definitely had a stronger preference towards the aloe versus this one right here. Outside of that, I think that it was still, I think it's in line with what I've kind of experienced from this coffee roaster. We're at 3 reviews of them at this point, and I feel like I have a pretty good gauge and idea of the way that their coffees are, and I feel like they are slightly more developed than I would typically like from something like this. With that being said, though, they still do tend to do a better job than the majority of other Korean coffee roasters I've had, so I do want to give them credit for that, even if they don't necessarily skew enough in line with my own preferences. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you did enjoy the aloe, or you do like really citric forward coffees, and I feel like this one's a very good fit for you, mostly because of just how pronounced that lime-like aspect was present within this coffee. Outside of that, it does offer some nice sweetness to it, as well as I think I knew once upon a time what John Small used as their roasting machine, but off the top of my head, I can't quite tell. I do think it's an older roasting machine as well, but it seems to work well, at least in terms of the sweetness, as their coffees have been generally on the sweeter side of things, especially this one. That's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the, Nensebo Mewa wash processed Ethiopia from John Small Roastery. Thank you for watching.